Before we start, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, can you please tell me from where and what time you're watching? Thanks.
The ad popped up while I was mindlessly scrolling through social media late one night. Prove your survival instincts. Win $150,000. It promised the ultimate adventure, testing resilience and wits in a remote, uncharted jungle. The ad was sleek and enticing, boasting glowing testimonials and breathtaking images of the lush wilderness. For someone like me, itching to break free from the monotony of my 9-to-5 life, it felt like destiny. I signed up without a second thought. A week later, I received a package containing a list of essential gear, a contract thick with legalese, and an itinerary. The challenge was called the Iron Will Expedition, supposedly organized by a company with years of experience hosting high-stakes survival games. It sounded legitimate, and the money was more than enough motivation. The location was an isolated rainforest in South America. When I arrived, I was struck by the sheer vastness of the place. Towering trees formed a dense canopy overhead, their leaves blotting out much of the sunlight. The air was damp, buzzing with the constant hum of unseen insects. I met the other participants at a rustic base camp. There were 11 others, a mix of adventurers, ex-military types, and a few thrill-seekers like me. Everyone seemed eager, though there was a palpable tension in the air. The first day was uneventful. We spent it settling into camp, getting to know one another, and listening to the guides. 3 men dressed in identical beige uniforms with no visible name tags. They were stone-faced, offering only the barest instructions about the rules of the challenge. We were to fend for ourselves, build shelters, forage for food, and navigate the unforgiving terrain. It all seemed straightforward, if grueling. But even on that first night, something felt off. The guides stayed distant, their watchful eyes betraying no emotion, as if we were test subjects under a microscope. By the third day, the cracks began to show. The jungle was unrelenting, sweltering heat by day, bone-chilling cold by night. Tempers flared as exhaustion set in, and the group's camaraderie started to crumble. Then came the first challenge. We were instructed to trek to a marked checkpoint deep in the jungle. The first person to arrive would receive extra rations and a sturdy tarp, a luxury in these conditions. But there was a catch. The last to arrive would be eliminated. I thought eliminated just meant disqualified. That assumption shattered when we reached the checkpoint. One of the participants, a middle-aged man named Carl, was the last to stumble in, his face pale and drenched in sweat. The guides ordered us to form a circle around him. Carl tried to laugh it off, muttering something about bad luck, but the tension was suffocating. Then one of the guides stepped forward holding a pistol. Without a word, he aimed and pulled the trigger. Carl crumpled to the ground, dead. The jungle seemed to go silent, the hum of insects drowned by the pounding of my heartbeat. Someone screamed, but the guides didn't flinch. One of them calmly announced, "This is your reality now. Only one of you will leave. Do what you must to survive." I wanted to run, to scream, to wake up from the nightmare. But the jungle was vast and unforgiving, and the guides had the only means of extraction. We were trapped. From that moment on, everything changed. The remaining 10 of us were no longer teammates in a survival challenge. We were competitors in a blood sport. The challenges grew crueler, designed to pit us against one another. One task required us to retrieve a flag from a high cliff, but the path was deliberately rigged with pitfalls. Another forced us to ration dwindling food supplies, knowing full well it would spark infighting. Each night, someone else was eliminated, their screams echoing through the jungle as the guides enforced their brutal rules. By the 5th day, alliances had formed and dissolved as quickly as the morning mist. Trust was a commodity none of us could afford. A young woman named Alyssa, who had been kind to me early on, was found dead near the river one morning. Whether it was an accident or sabotage, no one knew. or admitted to knowing. The paranoia was unbearable. As the days wore on, the challenges became less about physical survival and more about moral decay. One night, we were told to vote on who should be eliminated next. I felt the bile rise in my throat as I scribbled a name on the slip of paper, knowing my own name could just as easily appear on the majority's votes. The guides announced the unlucky victim without a shred of emotion, dragging him away as he begged for mercy. By the 8th day, only 4 of us remained. I barely recognized myself in the reflective surface of a stagnant pool. My face was gaunt, my eyes hollow, my hands trembling from both hunger and fear. The guides summoned us for the final challenge, their expressions as unreadable as ever. We were told the extraction point was miles away, deep in the jungle, and only one of us would make it. The unspoken implication was clear. We weren't just racing the clock, we were racing each other. I hesitated, but survival instinct took over. As we made our way through the dense foliage, I felt the weight of every step, every decision. One of the others, a wiry man named Jonah, tried to strike up an uneasy alliance, but I knew better. In this game, kindness was a liability. The final hours were a blur of adrenaline and horror. I don't remember much, only the sound of twigs snapping, the rustle of leaves, and the muffled cries as one by one the others fell. When I finally stumbled into the clearing at the extraction point, drenched in sweat and trembling, I was alone. The guides were waiting. They handed me a sealed envelope containing my prize money, their faces as blank as ever. No words of congratulations, no acknowledgement of what I had endured. As the helicopter lifted me out of the jungle, I stared down at the endless sea of green below, feeling nothing but emptiness. I had survived, but at what cost? I should have known better. The moment I accepted Alina's invitation to join this so-called Iron Circle challenge, I felt a twinge of doubt deep in my gut. Alina was always the reckless one, the kind of friend who craved thrills no matter the cost. But she had a way of pulling you in, her enthusiasm contagious. When she explained the challenge, survive a series of trials, outlast the rest, and walk away with a life-changing prize, I couldn't resist. It sounded absurd, sure, but I was desperate. Bills were piling up and I had nothing to lose. Besides, the prospect of doing it together with Alina seemed reassuring. The instructions were vague. We were to meet at an abandoned shipping yard on the edge of town at midnight. It was the kind of place you wouldn't stumble upon unless you were looking for trouble. The air smelled like rust and damp concrete, and the dim glow of a few scattered floodlights cast long, eerie shadows across rows of forgotten cargo containers. There were 17 of us, a strange crowd, each person seeming as lost as the next. There was a wiry man who wouldn't stop pacing, a teenager clutching her phone like a lifeline, and a woman in her 50s with a look of grim determination. Alina and I stood close, watching as figures emerged from the shadows. They were dressed in sharp grey uniforms, their faces hidden behind reflective visors. They didn't speak, just handed out small devices that buzzed in our hands and displayed the words, "Trust the process." The first few challenges were almost laughable. We climbed metal ladders, solved puzzles, and ran through mazes. It was like some twisted carnival game, but then came the eliminations. At first, I thought the losers were being escorted out, disqualified, sent home. That illusion shattered when I saw what happened to the first failure. A young guy named Matt hesitated on a rope bridge, his hands shaking as the timer ran out. Before he could step off, 2 of the masked figures seized him. His screams echoed as they dragged him into one of the shipping containers. When the doors slammed shut, silence followed. Alina squeezed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What the hell is this?" she whispered. I had no answer. By the 4th challenge, the mood had shifted entirely. The playful banter from earlier was gone, replaced by tense silence and wary glances. Each trial seemed designed to exploit our fears, crawling blindfolded through a tunnel filled with jagged metal, solving a near-impossible puzzle as alarms blared in our ears, balancing on a narrow beam suspended over. Something. I never looked down long enough to see what was beneath us. People started to crack. There was this guy, Amir, who was always calm and collected, until he wasn't. He shoved someone during the maze challenge, muttering about how they were slowing him down. Another contestant, a middle-aged woman named Clara, began to cry uncontrollably after finding a smiley face crudely painted in red on one of the walls. Those smiley faces, they were everywhere. At first I thought they were just graffiti, but the more I saw, the more deliberate they seemed. Every time someone failed, a new one appeared, as if mocking their absence. By the time we reached the penultimate round, only 5 of us remained. Alina and I tried to stay close, but something had shifted between us. She was quieter now, her gaze colder. I caught her watching me during the obstacle course, her expression unreadable. The final challenge was simple on the surface: a vote. 2 platforms, 2 contestants. Choose one person to advance. If both voted for the same person, the game would continue. If they voted for each other, the first to reach the finish line would win. Alina and I were pitted against each other. We stood there, the silence stretching unbearably. "You trust me, right?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. I nodded, but I didn't. Not anymore. When the timer started, I cast my vote. For her. And she did the same for me. The screen flashed red. We had no choice now but to race. The platform collapsed beneath us, and we sprinted through a gauntlet of swinging blades, electric shocks, and collapsing floors. Alina was fast, faster than I expected, but I was desperate. I shoved past her, my heart pounding as I reached the finish line. There was no celebration, just a hollow silence as I stood there gasping for air. Alina was gone, the others were gone, and there on the wall before me was the largest smiley face yet, painted in what I could only assume was blood. A voice crackled through the speakers, cold and detached. "Congratulations, you've won." "Won what? My freedom, my sanity." As I stumbled out of the shipping yard, the reality sank in. I was alone, and the faces of everyone who'd entered with me haunted my thoughts. That night, I dreamed of red smiley faces. They weren't just on walls anymore. They were everywhere, and I knew, deep down, I'd never be free of them. When Leo first proposed the plan, I didn't hesitate. He was known for pulling off the impossible, a man whose name was whispered with reverence in certain circles. If you wanted something stolen, and not just stolen but vanished without a trace, Leo was your guy. This time, though, his target wasn't jewels or art. It was something stranger, a reserve of ancient wildflower honey, stored in an off-the-grid facility in the Colorado wilderness. Leo claimed the honey wasn't just valuable, it was legendary, the kind produced by bees that thrived in the shadow of an extinct volcano, pollinating flowers that hadn't grown anywhere else for centuries. To collectors and food connoisseurs, it was more precious than gold. For me, it wasn't about the honey, it was the money. My life was a mess of overdue rent, maxed out credit cards, and a divorce I couldn't afford. When Leo said the payout could clear my slate and more, I didn't ask too many questions. The team he pulled together was small but precise. First, there was Vince, a towering ex-con with fists like sledgehammers and a talent for smashing through obstacles, be they steel doors or people. Then there was Danny, a logistics wizard who could spot patterns in chaos and turn them into plans. And finally me, Arlo, the tech guy. My job was to crack the systems, disable alarms, and make sure we were invisible. Leo called us his dream team. We spent weeks planning. The reserve was hidden deep in the mountains, surrounded by dense forests and accessible only by a winding dirt road. The building itself was nondescript, like a glorified warehouse but packed with cutting-edge security. Armed guards, motion sensors, thermal cameras, the works. But Leo had done his homework. There was a 2-minute gap in the camera feeds every few hours, thanks to a backup generator that temporarily knocked the system offline. My job was to exploit that window and keep us hidden. We arrived at the site just after midnight on a moonless night. The forest loomed around us, and the air was so still it felt suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat as we crept toward the building, our black clothes blending into the shadows. Everything was going smoothly. Too smoothly, I thought. Inside, the warehouse smelled faintly of beeswax and something else, something medicinal and ancient. The walls were lined with steel shelves, and at the center was a massive vault. That's where the honey was supposed to be. My fingers flew over my tablet, hacking into the system to disable the final locks. And then we opened the vault. Empty. Not a single jar. Just cold, barren shelves. For a moment, none of us moved. Danny's face went pale. "This can't be right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Leo's jaw tightened, his calm facade starting to crack. "No," he muttered. "This doesn't make sense." Before we could react, a harsh buzz filled the air, followed by a voice crackling over an unseen speaker. "Welcome, players." My blood turned cold. The voice was deep, distorted, and unnervingly calm. It wasn't the voice of a guard or anyone we'd expected to encounter. "Congratulations," the voice continued. "You've made it to the real game." "What game?" Vince growled, his fists clenched. The lights in the warehouse flickered and then cut out entirely, plunging us into darkness. I heard the slam of metal doors shutting, trapping us inside. Then came footsteps, deliberate and echoing. Shapes emerged from the shadows, figures clad in black, their faces obscured by masks. They carried weapons that gleamed faintly in the dim emergency lights. One of them stepped forward. "The rules are simple," he said. "Complete the challenges, survive, the winner takes all." "And if we don't play?" Leo asked, his voice steady but laced with tension. The man tilted his head slightly. "Refusing isn't an option." Before we could argue, the floor beneath us shifted. Walls descended from the ceiling, rearranging the space into a labyrinth of narrow corridors and towering obstacles. The first challenge began with a deafening horn blast. "Run," the voice ordered. The labyrinth was a nightmare. Guards patrolled the maze, their footsteps eerily silent as they hunted us. We had to dodge, crawl, and sprint through the twisting paths, all while staying ahead of our pursuers. Vince took the lead, his brute strength and agility keeping him just out of reach. Danny and I followed, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. By the time we reached the end, my legs felt like lead, but not all of us made it. Two members of the team, people I barely knew but whose faces I'd memorized, were dragged away by the guards, their screams echoing long after they disappeared. The next challenge was worse. We were herded into a small, featureless room with a digital timer counting down from 20 minutes. A series of puzzles appeared on the walls, riddles, codes, mechanical contraptions. Solve them, and we'd move on. Fail, and the room would lock, sealing us inside forever. I worked as fast as I could, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of the symbols in front of me. Danny was beside me, her usual composure fraying at the edges. Vince, on the other hand, was losing it, pounding the walls and yelling curses, and that's when it hit me. The real danger wasn't the puzzles or the guards. It was us. The game was designed to turn us against each other, to exploit our fear and desperation. When we reached the final challenge, only 3 of us were left. The prize, a sleek black briefcase, sat on a pedestal in the center of the room. The voice gave us our instructions. Only one of us could leave with it. Leo turned to me, his eyes cold. "Don't take this personally, kid," he said, pulling a knife from his belt. But I wasn't unarmed. I'd found a way to even the odds earlier, pocketing a small, sharp shard of glass from the obstacle course. As Leo lunged, I acted on instinct, slashing at his arm. He howled in pain, dropping the knife. Before he could recover, Danny tackled him, and together we managed to overpower him. When it was over, Danny and I stood there, panting and bloodied. "You take it," she said, nodding toward the briefcase. "I'm done with this." I didn't argue. I took the briefcase and left her behind, the doors opening for me as if by magic. Outside, the forest was eerily silent, as if the world hadn't just turned upside down. The briefcase was heavy in my hand, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Whatever was inside, it wasn't worth the cost. As I walked away, the voice echoed in my mind, "Welcome to the game." I knew then that I hadn't escaped. Not really. The game wasn't over. It would never be over. I shouldn't have ignored the warning signs. The moment I said yes to Leah's proposition, I felt an unease settle in my chest. Leah had always been the risk-taker, the one who thrived on adrenaline and danger. Her energy was magnetic, and no matter how reckless her plans were, she could always convince me to join. This time it was something she called the Iron Test. She described it as a series of challenges, each more grueling than the last, with a prize so immense it could change our lives forever. I didn't ask too many questions. I was drowning in debt and desperation, and Leah's confidence had a way of erasing doubt. The instructions were cryptic. We were told to meet at a desolate industrial complex on the outskirts of town just before midnight. The place reeked of oil and mildew, the towering steel structures casting ominous shadows under dim, flickering lights. Leah and I arrived together, a nervous excitement buzzing between us. There were 15 of us in total, a motley crew of strangers with one thing in common. We all looked like we needed a miracle. A woman in her late 40s fiddled with a silver bracelet, her lips moving in what I assumed was a prayer. A lanky teenager stared at the ground, his hood pulled low over his face. Leah stood next to me, radiating her usual confidence, though I noticed her glancing around more than usual. Before anyone could exchange more than a few awkward words, they appeared. 4 figures in black uniforms with mirrored masks stepped out from the shadows. They didn't introduce themselves or offer any kind of explanation. Instead, they handed each of us a sleek black wristband. The display blinked on with a single message: complete or be eliminated. The first tasks were deceptively simple. Crawl under metal beams, climb ropes, balance across narrow planks. It felt like a warped version of gym class. The only thing that unsettled me was the silence. No one laughed or cheered. The masked figures watched us without moving, their reflective visors making it impossible to tell where they were looking. Then came the first elimination. A burly man named Jonas hesitated for too long on a balance beam, his fear freezing him in place. Before anyone could help, 2 of the masked figures grabbed him and hauled him away. His shouts of protest echoed briefly before being swallowed by the heavy clang of a steel door. "Maybe they just sent him home," Leah whispered, though her tone didn't match her words. But by the second challenge, it was clear the stakes were far more sinister. The tasks became cruel. Crawl through a dark tunnel filled with broken glass. Hold your breath underwater while an unseen current tried to drag you under. Solve riddles while deafening alarms blared in your ears. Each failure resulted in another person disappearing. And then there were the symbols. They started small, tiny red spirals painted on walls and railings. But as the night wore on, they became more frequent and grotesque, spiraling into distorted faces with gaping mouths and hollow eyes. I realized they always appeared after someone was taken. Leah and I stuck together as long as we could, watching each other's backs during the chaos. But the challenges grew more isolating, designed to pit us against one another. By the penultimate round, only 5 of us remained. Leah had changed. Her usually bright eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, and her determination had hardened into something cold and desperate. The final test was a cruel mockery of choice. 2 podiums stood in the center of the room, each equipped with a single button. The instructions were clear: vote for your opponent to be eliminated, or face a race to the end. If both voted for the same person, that person would advance. If we voted for each other, we'd both have to run the gauntlet. Leah and I faced each other in the harsh, artificial light. "You trust me, don't you?" she asked, her voice trembling just enough to betray her fear. I nodded, but I didn't answer. The timer began and I pressed the button, choosing her. When the screen lit up, Leah's name was illuminated in red. She'd chosen me. The floor beneath us shifted, and we were both plunged into the gauntlet. Blades swung precariously close to our faces, floors crumbled beneath our feet, and electric shocks jolted through our bodies. Leah was faster than I'd ever seen her, but desperation gave me an edge. I didn't look back as I reached the end, collapsing to my knees in exhaustion. When I turned, Leah was gone. The room was empty except for me and a massive red spiral painted on the wall before me. It twisted endlessly, almost pulsating, and I realized it wasn't paint. "Congratulations," a mechanical voice said, echoing through hidden speakers. "You're the winner." Winner of what? There was no prize, no celebration, just a hollow silence that stretched endlessly as I stumbled out of the building. That night, I dreamed of spirals. They weren't just painted on walls anymore. They were on my skin, my hands, my face. And somewhere, in the corner of my dreams, I swore I saw Leah, her eyes hollow, her mouth stretched into an endless silent scream.